This is the PC case that everyone has been talking about. It is the Fractal Terra, and usually I don't mind when companies copy other companies, as long as they kind of switch it up a little bit, make it a bit different, maybe improve on the design that they're copying. And I guess that's like kind of what's happening here, but also not really. So I mean, clearly this was the inspiration for the Fractal Terra. It's called the Formed T1, and I've done a bunch of videos on this case. It really is something, but I was really surprised to see when researching the Fractal Terra and watching some videos about it, I did not see the T1 mentioned even once. And I mean, come on, like how can we talk about this but pretend that this doesn't exist, because the similarities are just mind-blowing to me. Like, both of them are 10 liters in volume. The Fractal Terra is just a little bit bigger. Both of them are sandwich layout, CNC aluminum cases. Both have very similar kind of anodized finish as well, at least in the silver version. Fractal even copied the split front panel design, which I find quite amusing, and also the clearance adjustment mechanism for the interior. Like I said though, and I really do mean this, I do not mind when companies copy other companies, because for the end consumer, usually that means a potentially better product, or maybe even just like a different experience. And I do think that is, pretty productive. And one of the big differences here is that the Fractal Terra is about $50 to $100 cheaper than the T1. So I mean, if it can do what the T1 can do, but at a cheaper price, then that's looking pretty good. Now that split in the front panel is still a bit weird for me. I've had the case for a few days now, but I just still instantly think of the T1 when I see it. But I will give credit to Fractal, because the exterior here as a package does look really good. I mean, I can see why so many people have decided to build in this thing. You've got these thick, sparkling metal panels, the wood plate on the front as well, which is unique on every case actually, which is pretty cool. And also the panel cutouts for airflow, which just look really good. When it comes to actual build quality though, that's where the Terra and the T1 are actually pretty different. Both of them are of course aluminum CNC anodized cases. Both of them have that sparkly kind of Apple MacBook finish, which a lot of people like, and I do like quite a lot as well. But I just couldn't help but notice a lot more kind of imperfections and manufacturing defects, I guess, on the Terra, which just don't exist on the T1. So mainly in the corners of panels, the top panels, the side panels, you've got these like folds and creases and dents, which, are just not really nice when you're up close with the case. I also really dislike the panel gap inconsistencies. Like, panel gaps of course are fine, but when you've got a big gap here and then a small gap here, it just doesn't look that appealing. The top panel as well just has a little bit more flex than I'd like, and on the T1, it is just absolutely rock solid. Now, of course, when your build is all said and done and it's sitting on your desk like, half a meter to a meter away from you, you're not really gonna be thinking about these imperfections. You won't even be able to see them. But yeah, there is definitely a difference in quality between these two cases. What matters then is the feeling that you get from each exterior. The T1 is as minimal and clean as it gets. You've got this ultra clean metal box with mesh on the sides. There's no branding, there's no front IO. The power button is this super tiny blip that you can barely see. You don't even really know it's a computer. The Terra, on the other hand, is the anti-machine. It's a more organic look, especially in the jade color, which might actually be the most popular option. The exterior here, on the other hand, just creates a sort of emotion or pull for some people, which I don't even know how to describe it in words, but some people just won't get that from the T1. Now let's take a closer look at the clearance adjustment mechanism, which is probably the most important feature of these two cases. And again, some of the videos that I've seen of the Terra saying that Fractal invented this or that it's a unique feature. Clearly though, it was copied straight from the Form T1, and this was the real first case to do this about 4 years ago. So in both of these cases, your graphics card and CPU cooler are mounted on opposite sides, and the goal of this mechanic is to adjust the clearance for either side. So for example, you can run a beefy graphics card with a small CPU cooler, or maybe more CPU cooling, but then only with a 2-slot card. Everyone's build is fit to them and the type of system that they're running. Honestly, this is a really sick feature. The T1 and the Terra do this a little bit differently though. The T1 has 45mm of total adjustment, whereas the Terra only has 30mm. Now, that extra 15mm doesn't really mean a lot for most of the builds out there. Basically, it allows you to run single slot graphics cards like a water block in the T1, and then gain up to 88mm of clearance for your CPU cooler. It's pretty niche, not many people will be doing that. For what it's worth though, both of these cases have that really important adjustment range between 2-slot and just above 3-slot graphics cards. The big difference though is how you do this. So with the T1, you kind of have to plan ahead. You've got 10 different levels of adjustment with the spine, and then you have these standoffs on the PCIe riser, which you do have to adjust and stack depending on the clearance that you go with. Honestly, it can be a bit finicky. The Terra, on the other hand, is a lot easier. You just loosen 4 screws and then you slide that internal chamber, depending on the clearance that you need. But yeah, basically you have complete freedom to adjust as you wish. So Fractal definitely have the easier method here, but it also does feel a bit cheaper. The T1 feels more intentional, more locked in. With the Terra, it can potentially move around a bit and not be perfectly lined up. Mine also had scratches here out of the box. Another big difference between these two cases is unfortunately cooling. Now, to show you what is truly possible in a 10-liter form factor, this is my new personal system with a 4090, a 7800X3D, and two 240mm radiators with 5 fans, all packed into the Form T1. Now, there's a bit of custom work happening here. Obviously, it doesn't really support this out of the box, but you can at least do a 240 pretty comfortably up the top. So you would think that the Fractal Terra, pretty much being the same size, actually being a little bit bigger at 10.4 liters, it should be able to do the same thing. But unfortunately, that is just not the case, and it's not even close. Basically, in the Fractal Terra, you have no liquid cooling support at all, which I just find really disappointing, to be honest. Like, not even a single 240 or a 120. That just, to me, is not really acceptable. All you have is a measly little 120mm fan slot, which sits underneath the power supply. But even if you were to stick with air cooling in the T1, and let's say you would do an identical system in both cases, you can install 2 fans in the T1 versus just 1 in the Terra. And, that will make a difference. That extra fan underneath your motherboard, around that CPU cooler. I'd expect that to help out quite a lot when it comes to direct motherboard cooling for the CPU heatsink, and also just a bit of extra airflow for the graphics card as well. So to explore the cooling in the Fractal Terra, I wanted to use the 4080 Founders Edition card. I've already tested this in the T1, so I guess the main objective here is to see how the GPU temperatures and the noise levels compare. For the CPU and the motherboard, I've also used the AMD 7800X3D plugged into the Asus B650i Strix, and for cooling there, I've used the 47mm tall Blackridge. But I don't actually recommend this setup because it's not compatible. So usually this cooler doesn't work with the AM5 socket. That's why I've used this new short backplate here from Thermal Grizzly. Basically, this allows you to run AM4 coolers no matter what. However, I did still run into issues with this particular board, and long story short, I had to remove the primary M.2 and audio stack, as well as the entire socket retention mechanism. So yeah, don't do this, just find a different B650 motherboard with smaller heatsinks and this cooler will work fine. But yeah, other than that, we've got some low profile DDR5 memory, a 1TB M.2 drive, Corsair SF750 for the power supply, and that bottom 120mm fan. You've got 25mm of total thickness clearance to play with here, so unfortunately the Phanteks T30 won't fit, but this Noctua NFA12 should help us out quite a bit. And as usual for sandwich cases, I've got this running as exhaust, so taking in the hot air from within the case and exhausting that outwards. Also, by creating negative pressure, this encourages new cold air to be pulled into the side panels. Specifically, exhausting that hot air coming from the flow-through fan, that's pretty much the primary role that this fan will be serving. Now, something else that Fractal copied from the T1 is the ability to mount the power supply on standoffs. So if you're using a graphics card which pushes air through the top like the Founders Edition, you can create a bit of a gap here for that air to escape. This is actually something that you can't do in the T1 when using a 3-slot card, since you've kind of already maxed out the width of the case, but since the Terra is a bit wider, you've got a bit of extra breathing room here to space things out. I will mention that cable management is, kind of tight here in the Terra with the stock SF750 cables. Most people will probably want to run a fan grill on that bottom fan just to avoid it getting jammed up, but overall, things are looking reasonably tidy. Also, pretty important note, just like the T1, you will need a custom 16-pin GPU cable for most 40 series cards. Either one from Mod DIY or the cable mod one that I have here will work just fine. In the end, not gonna lie, it's a pretty clean looking build, especially for just a quick test system. But how does it perform? So we've got Firmark here running for about 45 minutes and the number to beat is 64 degrees. That's what I was getting in the T1 with, again, the 4080 FE at about the same room temperature as well. And here we get 66, 67. Now that's a little bit warmer, but we're also running at a higher GPU power for whatever reason, 320 watts versus the 300-ish watts that I was getting in the T1. So considering that extra 20 watts, I mean, we're probably closer to like a difference of like 1 degree between these two cases. Also, that bottom exhaust fan is just absolutely mental in this case. If you are building in a Terra, I would say it's like pretty much essential. The amount of hot air that it is pushing out from underneath the case. I mean, let's just say if you're like playing and you get cold hands, just put this PC next to your mousepad and you will never have that problem again. But yeah, a 4080 Fe build in the Terra, I can actually recommend this. The 7800X3D as well seems to be totally fine given the insanely low power draw that thing has. For a gaming build, this actually would be a pretty epic setup. The only real issue I see with the Terra is if you want to go beyond gaming. Like if you want to build an editing system or a production system and you just don't want to feel restricted in terms of CPU options, that's where the Form T1 is the perfect alternative. You've got better hardware compatibility, superior build quality as well, which you do notice if you're kind of working up close with the case. And I do think for more conventional style graphics cards, putting the 2 fans in the T1 could potentially offer, superior cooling versus the just 1 fan that we have in the Terra. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Fractal Terra, can definitely recommend it. I'll see you all in the next one.